Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com. In this video, I'm going to be giving you tips and techniques on how to deal with an untreated space, both when it comes to playback and when it comes to recording. I'm in the process of putting together my studio, and I've had to deal with an untreated space for a little while, and so I can give you a few tips that can kind of help things along the way. By the way, by the end of the week, I'm hoping to have a really cool video put together that's going to demonstrate the playback and the recording within an untreated room, a semi-treated room, and then a fully complete treated room, and be able to compare and contrast some of those. I think that should be illuminating. Anyway, how do we deal with an untreated space? Well, the obvious answer to that one is, if we can, we treat it. But even if we have the time and the resources to do so, we still have to actually go through the process, which means at some point we're probably going to have to deal with an untreated space regardless. So how do we do that? Well, my number one tip is going to be getting the initial setup right. Even if we end up treating our room, which we should, the initial setup's going to be really important, and there are certain principles that we can enact. Now, if you happen to be in a large room, you're going to want to put the speakers in a position that's not really too close to any of the boundaries. This way, you are able to get the best, fully functional, optimal sound from those speakers. However, a lot of us are in smaller rooms. I am in a smaller room, and I would say anything that's under 17 feet by 13 feet qualifies as a smaller room. So, how do we deal with our speaker positioning in those situations? Well, we probably want to eliminate one of the reflective surfaces by putting our speakers flush to a wall. Yes, typically speaking, we want to leave some breathing room behind our speakers, but again, that's only if we have a properly sized room to begin with. If we don't, a better approach is usually to put the speaker right up against the wall, eliminating a reflective surface. Now, if your speakers are backported, that's also going to be a bit of a consideration. We might need to leave some degree of an air gap, otherwise the bass response is not going to be correct. It can be a little bit tricky, but that is generally the better way to go. In addition, we want our speakers to be facing front. A lot of the times people aim speakers at their ears. This is not really the correct way to do it. Speakers are designed to produce sound in a conical manner, so it flushes out. It's not like laser beams that shoot directively and are going to go past your ears. In fact, if you look at a tweeter, you'll notice that a tweeter is dome-shaped. You'll notice that the center of your woofer is dome-shaped, and that is so that sound projects like this, not like this. Well, I mean, sound kind of does that anyway, but regardless. You don't need to toe in. Now, when do you want to toe in? You want to toe in if you're not able to produce an equilateral triangle in your listening position. The idea here is that the distance between your left and right speaker should also be the distance between your listening position and your right speaker, and your listening position and your left speaker. That creates an equilateral triangle that's going to give you great imaging. However, we don't always have the space to do that. If we end up being a little bit too close to the speakers, we can toe them in a little bit and shrink the image to compensate. And that is why we would want to do that. The other thing about speaker placement is typically we want to be equidistant or symmetrical in the placement. So if we are 2.5 feet from one wall, we want to be 2.5 feet from the other wall as well. My left speaker, 2.5 feet from one wall. My right speaker, 2.5 feet from the other wall. Symmetrical image. Generally speaking, that's the best course. Although sometimes you end up in a strange situation where you have a window that's offset from the center of the room, and sometimes that can change that. Which I do, and I might need to adjust for it. Oh, one other thing about speaker placement, usually we do not want to have our speakers directly on a desk, because if we have them on a desk, then they are going to vibrate the desk. They are going to be coupled to it, and then we are going to get all of the interesting resonances that come along with that. It is typically better to have speakers mounted on their own stands if you have the space for it. Tip number 2, also a good one, even if you end up treating your room, is picking your mix position. Usually, when you are in a smaller room, or really any room actually, you want to avoid the middle of the room. That's where you're going to get the most exaggerated peaks and dips when it comes to the sound interacting over itself. It's going to be the worst place to be when it comes to getting an accurate response. A better place to be is going to be maybe about 1/3 of the way down the room. So if you are in a 9-foot room, for example, you would want to be 3 feet from the nearest boundary. That said, it doesn't have to necessarily be an exact science. Sometimes different rooms function differently. You might want to be a little further back or a little bit closer. You need to just kind of listen and feel it out. But picking a good mix position is certainly going to help. And generally speaking, the further out from the center of the room in a small space, the better. Tip number 3, we're going to need some headphones. The reality is that if you're in a small space and it is untreated, you are not going to have an accurate frequency response, and chances are it's not even going to be close. So we're going to need to switch our perspective. We're going to need to be able to hear in a different environment, and the best way to do that is with headphones. Now, I have 2 recommendations. You can either get 2 sets of different headphones. Headphones are generally not that accurate, but if you can switch between one set and another set and hear the differences, then you're going to be able to generally understand how things are going to translate. Or you could do what I recommend, which is pick up Slate VSX, which is going to emulate multiple playback environments, and that's going to give you a lot of different perspectives. That's been super helpful for me while not having this room treated. Number 3, when we're recording, do not sleep on dynamic microphones. Dynamic microphones are excellent. Even in treated rooms, dynamic microphones can be great. They can be great for vocals, they can be great for guitars, they can be great for drums, they can be great for pretty much anything. Do not underestimate the power of dynamic microphones. In an untreated space, dynamic microphones are typically better than condensers. And yes, there's a bit of irony here. I am speaking into a condenser microphone right now. That's because I'm not being too precious about the sound. But if I wanted to eliminate the room, the best way for me to do it without putting up room treatment would be to grab something like an SM57, which is a very, very usable microphone and very inexpensive. Or my preference for dynamic microphones on most sources is an Electro Voice RE20. A lot of people prefer a Shure SM7. I prefer the RE20 most of the time, but it kind of depends on the application. These are both within the $300 to $400 ballpark and are really, really excellent top quality microphones. The difference here is that the RE20 is going to have a lot of character. It's got a lot of body around 300 hertz, 400 hertz. It's got a very distinct saturation and roundness to it. It is not a subtle microphone. You can pretty much pick it up and identify it by sound once you get familiar with it immediately. An SM7 is going to be a much more neutral capture. If you're doing things that require something to be a little bit cleaner, an SM7 is a good pick. But personally, my opinion is that if we're going for cleaner, something that's like a really neutral and well-balanced condenser microphone is usually the better option, and that's why I simply don't have one. But if I was working only in untreated spaces, I'd probably have an SM7 as well. Tip number 4, bookshelves, furniture, DIY treatments like hanging coats and things like that do actually help a little bit. They're not ideal and they're not predictable in their response. They're a little bit harder to get right, but setting up bookshelves will help with some diffusion, meaning you're going to get less concentrated modes because you're scattering the reflections a little bit, and certain things like couches and coats that are hung up do provide a little bit of absorption, typically not in the lower end of the frequency spectrum, although sometimes a little bit, but they do kind of help with the mids and upper mids a little, and certainly can help with the highs, so it's not absolutely the worst way to do it. Just don't go thinking that you can stick a microphone in a closet with a bunch of coats hung around you and you're going to actually get like a good solid capture. You're probably not. You're going to sound like you're in a closet with a bunch of coats hung around you. It just kind of is what it is. But it's better than just being in a closet with nothing hung around you. And by the way, side note, don't record yourself in a closet. I don't know why people do that. I guess because it kind of looks like a booth, but that's not really... It's not really the way to roll. All right, guys, if you dig these tips, if you find them helpful, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, hit subscribe with the bell notification so you get notified. Also, if you sign up for the WeissAdvice newsletter, yes, this is still going, you will get a free copy of the low-end guide. It is a really great, thorough tutorial. I just jump on it while this offer is still available. And lastly, you know what we say here at WeissAdvice. We are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.